People all over the world take the knee. But for centuries, black resistance to oppression has taken many forms. When the quarterback Colin Kaepernick first took the knee in 2016, during the national anthem at an NFL game, there was a huge backlash. Ultimately, this act of defiance cost him his livelihood.
I'm going to continue to stand with the people that are being oppressed. This country stands for freedom, liberty, justice for all. And it's not happening for all right now.
Maybe you should find a country that works better for him. Let him try.
In the years since, taking the knee has become a powerful symbol of resistance, as potent as Martin Luther King's civil rights marches, and as iconic as Tommie Smith and John Carlos's black-gloved fist at the 1968 Mexico Olympics. Sports people around the world have taken the knee. On the football pitch,
a powerful image to show football's social conscience.
And on the racing track.
And that is a positive message from F1.
Where will this symbol of resistance lead? And where did it come from? Is it a passive act or an act of defiance? To answer these questions, we travel back through the centuries to the earliest resistance by enslaved Africans against racial oppression in the Americas. We begin with a somewhat mythical but very real figure who took on the Goliath of the most powerful army in the world and defeated it. Queen Nanny, Granny Nanny, or as she's also known, Nanny of the Maroons, is Jamaica's original national hero. Her face adorns the country's $500 bill, recalling the story of a freedom fighter who stood up to the might of the British military to win freedom for her enslaved people. In 1655, Oliver Cromwell's forces invaded Jamaica and populated it with a seemingly endless stream of enslaved West Africans brought to toil on the island's sugar plantations. One of the many was Nanny. Along with her 4 brothers, she's believed to have been abducted from the Ashanti tribe in present-day Ghana and transported in chains across the Atlantic. Together with her brothers, she escaped and took up arms in rebellion to win battle after battle. The pages of the local weekly, the Jamaica Courant, was filled with advertisements offering rewards for the runaways. But Nanny and her rebels offered something more valuable: freedom. Other runaways were inspired to join them in the rugged Blue Mountains of eastern Jamaica, a settlement that is still known today as Nanny Town. How she achieved this is a matter of folklore, including magical powers attributed to her. Stories survive of her guerrilla tactics, the use of sophisticated camouflage, and how her followers communicated by drum beats and the call of an African horn, the abeng, to sound the alarm. Nanny Town was finally captured and destroyed. Nanny and her followers escaped to higher ground, where they were faced with two options: starvation or surrender. At this desperate stage, the story goes, she had a vision telling her to never give up the fight. She woke up the following morning to find a handful of seeds which she planted on a hillside as the vision had instructed. Within a week, giant-sized pumpkins had grown to provide enough food for her followers. Till today, the hillside is known as Pumpkin Hill. Nanny never gave up the fight, but she did agree a truce with Britain in return for legal freedoms and 500 acres of land for her followers. One painful condition of the treaty was that the Maroons, as they were known, would now be obliged to return any fugitive slaves they discovered. According to legend, Nanny signed the treaty through gritted teeth and then demanded that the British redcoats shoot her. When they eventually complied and fired their muskets, her body is said to have whirled like a dervish as she caught each of the musket balls with her bare hands. She returned them to the British commander with the words, "There is peace," and then, pointing to the sky, added, "Only one can kill me." Jamaica was not the only island in the region in revolt during the 18th century. Toussaint Louverture would lead modern history's most successful rebellion by enslaved people. The island of Hispaniola had been divided and renamed. One side, Santo Domingo, was governed by Spain, and the other, Saint Domingue, was ruled by France. Thousands of miles away, the French Revolution of 1789 extended citizenship to anyone with a parent born in France. Culminating in a wide-scale revolt. On the 22nd of August 1791, the so-called Night of the Fire, all hell broke loose. Plantations were set ablaze and there was widespread bloodshed. From the ashes, Toussaint Louverture emerged as the rebellion's natural leader. A skillful tactician, he initially sided with Spain against France. The French response was to quell the threat from its colonial rivals by extending citizenship to all people within its empire. Toussaint reciprocated by switching allegiance to secure a French-approved legal hold on Saint Domingue, after which he conquered Santo Domingo and abolished slavery from Hispaniola forever. Back in France, Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor, was outraged at Louverture's unilateral constitution. He sent 20,000 troops across the ocean to restore his authority. In the ensuing battles, Bonaparte's army suffered huge losses against Toussaint's fighters. Eventually, the French offered him a peace treaty, but insisted that he come to France in person to sign it. It was a trap. Arriving at what he thought was a diplomatic meeting on the island to discuss terms, Toussaint was handcuffed and quickly transported to France in custody and thrown in a dungeon where he spent the rest of his days petitioning Napoleon for his release. Less than a year later, he was dead. Back in Saint Domingue, the capture of their figurehead spurred his supporters on in battle, The French were eventually driven from the island, never to return. In 1804, the Haitian Republic was proclaimed, free from enslavement and free from colonial powers. The legend of Toussaint Louverture has inspired many literary tributes, including this from the Romantic poet William Wordsworth. Though fallen thyself, never to rise again, live and take comfort. Thou hast left behind powers that will work for thee, air, earth, and skies. There's not a breathing of the common wind that will forget thee. Louverture and Nanny before him fought fire with fire. They faced violent oppression with violent uprisings and achieved freedom for their people. Next, we turn to Britain, the heart of an empire, the very core of the world's most successful colonial power, to see if the pen was mightier than the sword. Oludah Equiano's story begins in his homeland of Igbo, now part of Nigeria. In his autobiography, he describes having lived a happy childhood among a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets. He shared an especially strong bond with his mother. The two were inseparable. Yet one day, they were forced apart forever. Oludah and his sister had been minding the house while the rest of the family had left to do their work. Without warning, two men and a woman scrambled over their walls, seizing them and running off into the woods with them. Before long, Equiano found himself on a slave ship. He describes the paralyzing fear that ran through him, chained as he was to a multitude of other captives in stifling conditions. He recalls an almost inconceivable scene of horror. During the years of bondage that followed, he was sold several times and failed in his attempts to escape. Eventually, he was offered the opportunity to purchase his freedom using money he had earned trading loose items. He paid the ransom and settled in London, where he became a renowned abolitionist. Bearing his own traumatic memories of enslavement, his voice was especially important in the movement. Yet his eminence attracted hostility. He was branded a fraud by his distractors, who sought to undermine his testimony. In the April 1792 issue of the Oracle, a letter appeared claiming that he had never been to Africa, but was born and bred in the Danish island of Santa Cruz in the West Indies. The article read sneeringly, "What, we will ask any man of plain understanding, must that cause be which can lean for support on falsehoods as audaciously propagated as they are easily detected?" 2 days later, the Star reprinted the allegations. Equiano called on his colleagues and supporters to back him. They threatened the Oracle with legal action. The newspaper immediately retracted the letter, conceding that it was likely part of an anti-abolitionist plot to weaken the evidence brought against the enslavement trade. It was far from the last of such attempts to discredit the veracity of black suffering. Sometime in the late 1720s, Ignatius Sancho was born on a slave ship in the turbulence of the Middle Passage His mother died not long after. His father chose to die than be enslaved. On arriving in London, the infant orphan was taken to live with 3 sisters in Greenwich. He grew to become a sociable figure. He acquainted himself with a British peer of the realm, John Montagu, who was so impressed by Sancho's intellect, he encouraged him to read and write, lending him books from his personal library. Becoming more keenly aware of his enslavement, Sancho fled the oppressive household of the 3 sisters to the refuge of the Montagu family, where he persuaded them to employ him as a butler. With the Montagus, Sancho immersed himself in music, poetry, reading, and writing. He became a celebrated figure in aristocratic circles and acquainted himself with the great and the good. Above all, Sancho was a man of letters. One of his most acclaimed correspondences was with the influential novelist Laurence Sterne, author of Tristram Shandy. In it, Sancho called on the author to speak out about the enslavement trade. "Think in me you behold the uplifted hands of thousands of my brother Moors." In reply, Sterne proclaimed Sancho's cause, declaring a shared human condition, a brotherhood, bound in blood and unseparated by insensible gradations in the colour of skin. His response was widely published and became a touchstone for the abolition of the slave trade. Through the power of his pen, Sancho articulated the black experience in Britain. He wrote that he felt like a lodger, and hardly that, on the streets of the country's capital. This sense of alienation is echoed by the experience of the so-called Windrush generation of post-war immigrants from the Caribbean and their children who settled in Britain for years, only to discover a half-century later that they were no longer welcome and had no rights of abode. Shortly before Ignatius Sancho's death in 1780, he mentions in a letter the case of a young enslaved woman who had authored and published a collection of poems. A genius in bondage, he called her. The woman in question was Phillis Wheatley, whose poems on various subjects were published in London in 1773 when she was 19. She was born near the Gambia and, like Sancho, was separated from her family forever when she was snatched as a child and enslaved. Snatched from Afrique's fancied happy seat, as she put it. She was transported over the Atlantic and sold in Boston to a wealthy merchant. There she was given his surname, Wheatley, while her first name recalled the ship that had transported her, the Phillis. Unusual for someone enslaved, she received an extensive education from the Wheatley family, providing her with the reading necessary for nurturing her poetic skills. She was a rarity. The Wheatleys were keen to show her off to family and friends. In 1773, the mistress of the house took her on a trip to London, hoping that Phillis might be able to have her poetry published. She succeeded, and her poems on various subjects received widespread praise on both sides of the Atlantic. On her return to Boston, she was released from bondage. From then on, Wheatley dedicated her writing to the emancipation of Afrique's blameless race, as she put it. At the climax of the American Revolution, for example, she questioned the rhetoric of freedom which it championed. She warned of the omission of enslaved people from the fabled metaphor of the American Constitution. Even if America was freed from Britain, she argued, not all of America would be free until slavery was abolished. After all, what did a proclamation of freedom mean if it only applied to arbitrarily selected Americans? If all were created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, why were some people excluded? In other words, Black Lives Matter, a sentiment that America continues to grapple with.
Something as I've gained more knowledge about what's going on in this country in the past, what's going on currently, these aren't new situations. This isn't new ground. To me, this is something that has to change. And when there's significant change, and I feel like that flag represents what it's supposed to represent, and this country is representing people the way that it's supposed to, I'll stand.
In every human breast, Wheatley wrote, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. That principle would guide the fight for equal rights and justice in America for centuries.
Sojourner Truth, born Isabel Baumfree, was one of 10 or 12 children of a single family born into slavery in 1797. The family lived in a Dutch-speaking part of New York, and Truth spoke only Dutch until she was a 9-year-old and forced to learn English. In her early 30s, Truth managed to escape with her infant child, Sophia. She found her calling in 1843 when she converted to Methodism. On June the 1st, Pentecost Sunday, she heard the Spirit of God calling on her to preach the truth. This divine command led her to change her name from Isabel Baumfree to Sojourner Truth. Traveling north through Connecticut to Massachusetts, she began to preach restlessly, giving inspired, improvised sermons on the abolition of slavery. She also fought for women's rights wherever she went, attending women's rights conventions and lending her voice there. During this time, she came to know other prominent abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Like Douglass, Truth's legacy as a symbol of resistance has been manipulated in different ways by different parties. Most famously, in 1851, on a lecture tour through the state of New York, Truth delivered a speech on women's rights, which later became known as her Ain't I a Woman speech. In it, she demanded equal rights for women as well as for black people. Fascinatingly, the speech has been recorded in dramatically different ways. The first version was published only a month after Truth delivered it and made no mention of the question, Ain't I a Woman, which has become so famous since. The speech then received wider publicity during the American Civil War, when a leading white feminist abolitionist, Frances Dana Barker Gage, published an altered version. Gage inserted the repeated question, Ain't I a Woman, which gave the speech the title it's known by today. Notably, Gage edited Truth's speech to have characteristics of Southern slave dialects. It's highly unlikely that Truth actually spoke like this, since she was born and raised Dutch-speaking in New York State. Original reports of the speech also suggested that Truth was warmly received by the audience, but Gage recorded that Truth met with hisses and calls to prevent her from speaking. Gage herself admitted that her edited version had given but a faint sketch of the original speech, but she believed her version was stronger and more palatable to white American readers. In other words, it made abolitionism more saleable. The white abolitionist agenda had forced Truth's successes to be distorted and her identity unknowingly sacrificed in its attempt to achieve what it sought to within the wider story of history. Nat Turner was another who claimed divine inspiration for his leadership. He was a preacher born enslaved in Virginia. 30 years later, he would lead an insurrection against slave owners. He was deeply religious. He is said to have known no book but the Bible. On February the 12th, 1831, atmospheric conditions ignited a spiritual curiosity in him. An annular solar eclipse chastened the skies above Virginia. To Turner, this was a sign, the hand of a black man reaching across the sun. He quickly began acquiring weapons. A few months later, on August the 13th, further atmospheric disturbances made the sun appear bluish-green. This was the final sign. The ordained time for resistance had arrived. The rebellion was successful to begin with, Turner and his followers freeing many enslaved Africans. The insurrection was, however, rapidly extinguished. Hundreds of federal soldiers and thousands of militiamen crushed it. In retribution, scores of black people were lynched and killed, and Turner was hanged in Jerusalem, Virginia. The rebellion put an end to the white Southern myth that enslaved people were either too content with their lot or too servile to mount an armed revolt. Its failure had resonance. Time for black people in that area of Virginia was measured from the hopeful starting point of Old Nat's War. For many years in black churches throughout the country, Turner's self-sacrifice caused the name Jerusalem to refer not only to the biblical location, but also, covertly, to the place where the rebel preacher met his doom. The stories of Old Nat's War was shared amongst the congregation, sparking the hope and the promise of power against slaveholders and a future of freedom, gathering fuel for the movement. Frederick Douglass escaped his enslavement in 1838 and became a great writer and orator. A runaway from the Southern house of bondage, his back all horribly scarred by the lash. With the bitter remembrance of a life of slavery, he published his memoirs, telling of his past history, his present condition, his future prospects as a stern avenger of outraged humanity. As an abolitionist, Douglass was forced to choose sides between African Americans who wanted to return to Africa and those who wanted to remain in the land of their birth. Douglass chose remaining and fighting for change in America, at odds with those who favored repatriation, such as the American Colonization Society. In a letter published in his newspaper The North Star in 1848, Douglass wrote that the society was next to slavery the deadliest foe of the colored man. Like Sojourner Truth or Colin Kaepernick centuries later, Frederick Douglass refused to be silenced.
No one's tried to quiet me, and to be honest, it's not something I'm gonna be quiet about. I'm gonna speak the truth when I'm asked about it. People are dying in vain because this country isn't holding their end of the bargain up. Giving freedom and justice and liberty to everybody. It's something that's not happening.
On 4th of July 1852, Douglass delivered his most famous speech. What to the slave is the 4th of July? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence, he asks. Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Am I called upon to express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Famously, Douglass's views were subject to change and development throughout his life. Early on, he aligned himself with William Lloyd Garrison's doctrine of moral persuasion, a non-resistant approach to abolishing slavery. Yet later, he came to sympathize with more violent forms of resistance, diverging from Garrison's stance. Essential to Douglass's later support of violent resistance was the memory of Toussaint's revolt. He publicly praised Toussaint Louverture's use of violence to secure freedom for people in Haiti, seeing Toussaint as the noble liberator of his brave and industrious people and his republic, the freest and mightiest on the globe. Toussaint's triumph inspired Douglass's thinking about a black revolution in America. It set a precedent for the freedom of black people globally. The freedom that has come to the colored race the world over is largely due to the brave stance taken by the black sons of Haiti 90 years ago. Posthumously, Douglass's changing stances have enabled him to become a very flexible symbol of resistance. In modern-day America, both Republicans and Democrats celebrate Douglass, co-opting him as a proud symbol for different reasons, latching on to contrasting aspects of Douglass's ideology. However he's viewed, Douglass remains a towering figure of historic resistance. The Dred Scott case of 1857 left an indelible mark in the history of US race relations. After years of being transported around and leased out by various different owners, Scott brought a case to the Missouri courts, claiming that he and his wife Harriet should be granted their freedom because they had lived in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory for 4 years, where slavery was illegal. Through a series of disputed verdicts, the case eventually rose to the Supreme Court. Here, at the highest judicial level, the lower court's precedence of once free, always free was overturned. This precedence held that if an enslaved person achieved freedom in a free state, on their return to a slave state, they would remain free. The court decided 7-2 against Scott. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney ruling that black people are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. Since they were not citizens, black people did not possess the legal standing to bring suit in a federal court. The ruling forcefully confirmed that Scott was the private property of the owners and therefore was not eligible to bring such a suit, nor was the court eligible to intervene in the private matters of his owners. After proceedings at the Supreme Court concluded, a group of leading abolitionists helped to buy the Scotts their freedom. Meanwhile, the Civil War, which would erupt in 1861, was brewing ever more ominously. The Scott case seriously increased tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in the North and South. America has wrestled with the judgment in the Dred Scott case for more than 150 years. Still today, there are those in America who question the citizenship rights of African Americans, including that of President Barack Obama. William Still was born the free child of parents who were born enslaved. His father purchased his freedom, and his mother, after one unsuccessful attempt to escape, ran away with 2 of her 4 children. They later farmed a 40-acre plot in the New Jersey Pines, where William was born in 1821. He left home at 20 and later joined the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, through which he helped enslaved people on the run from the South. Often they would board at his home in Philadelphia,
en route to the safe haven of Canada across the border. Some 800 runaways, including 60 children, were helped in this way by his organization. One arrival from the south, upon investigation, the man turned out to be Still's own brother, left in slavery 40 years earlier when his mother fled to the north. Still's meticulous notes are the best kept records of the Underground Railroad as this clandestine route to freedom became known, providing names, locations, and the experiences of runaways from slavery. They are, as Still wanted, a monument to the heroism of bondmen under the yoke, a testament to their desperate struggles, such that the terrible oppression that they were under should be kept green in the memory of this and coming generations. The Underground Railway has many heroes. Chief amongst them is Harriet Tubman, whose success in helping enslaved men, women, and children to freedom is unparalleled. In her own words, "I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Tubman made 13 trips to the south and rescued approximately 70 people from plantation bondage. She carried out her missions in winter, under cover of darkness, and used the stars in the night sky to guide her passengers to freedom, as she had done for her own escape years earlier. Her success made her a target, a hunted woman with a reward of $40,000 on her head. The US Congress rushed through the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 to make it a crime to harbor runaways, and sanctioned the brutal treatment of any who were recaptured and returned to their owners. However, during the Civil War, Tubman was recruited by government forces as a scout and spy. And at the raid on the Combahee Ferry in 1863, where rebel forces were defeated, she helped liberate more than 700 enslaved people. After the war and the subsequent assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, and Tubman immersed herself in the women's suffrage movement. But the struggle for racial justice did not end for her. On returning to New York, a war hero, she was severely injured when white passengers violently ejected her from a train. Many generations on, African-American war veterans would discover when they went back to the States after serving their country in conflicts abroad that they were still not afforded the equal rights and justice of their fellow Americans.